He was disgusted by his fat daughter. He sold her to a mountain man, but what he received was a goddess. The deal was made in front of the whole town, mockery echoing like a church bell in the cold morning air. A father's shame, a daughter's tears, a stranger's silent hand reaching out. But in the lonely shack high in the mountains, the truth begins to shine. This so-called useless girl can heal the sick, sing hymns that stir hearts, and carry a secret deed worth more than gold. When her father comes to take her back, bringing guns, greed, and the railroad at his side, the valley holds its breath. Will the mountain man fight with bullets, or with something far stronger? Because the question is no longer who she belongs to, but whether the girl once sold in shame can rise as the goddess who saves them all. What will happen when love, faith, and a hidden truth collide on the edge of the frontier? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter mountain wind howled through the trading post's rough-hewn timbers as Karen May stood frozen, her mother's well-worn quilt clutched against her chest like a shield. The familiar pattern sewn into its fabric brought no comfort now, not with her father's words still ringing in her ears. Useless. Abel May's voice boomed across the crowded room, making the oil lamps flicker. That's what she is, eating more than she's worth. His meaty hand gripped Karen's arm, forcing her forward as if she were nothing more than cattle at auction. The trading post's usual bustle had gone quiet as death. Karen could feel every eye upon her, could hear the snickers and whispers that burned worse than the winter cold. Women who'd known her since childhood suddenly found the dusty floorboards fascinating. Men elbowed each other, some grinning, others shaking their heads in disgust. "Who will take her?" Abel demanded, yanking Karen's arm higher. "Got good cooking skills. Knows her herbs." "Someone make me an offer." Karen's cheeks blazed with shame, but she wouldn't give her father the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She fixed her gaze on a crack in the far wall, trying to make herself as small as possible, though that had never worked before. Her father had always made sure she knew exactly how much space she took up in the world. The crowd shifted, and through the sea of familiar faces, Karen caught sight of a stranger. He stood head and shoulders above most men, his broad frame wrapped in buckskins worn smooth by weather and work. A long scar traced down one side of his weathered face, disappearing into his beard. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Deep-set and watchful, they carried none of the mockery or disgust she saw in the others. "Come on now," Abel pressed, impatience making his voice sharp. "Surely someone needs a woman, even one like this." He shook Karen's arm for emphasis, making her stumble. The stranger moved then, his motions smooth as flowing water. The crowd parted before him like spooked cattle, leaving a clear path to where Karen stood with her father. Up close, she could see the threads of silver in his dark hair, the way his hands, though massive, moved with careful precision as he unslung a heavy sack from his shoulder. "I reckon these might interest you." His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the hushed room. The sack landed with a soft thump at Abel's feet, prime furs spilling out onto the planks. A glass jug of whiskey followed, amber liquid catching the lamplight. The trading post erupted in shocked whispers. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs as her father's grip finally loosened. Abel snatched up the sack, greed brightening his eyes as he examined the pelts. Beaver, fox, and marten, all prime winter catches. "Mighty fine offer, Mr. Abel let the question hang. "Boone. Michael Boone." The stranger, Michael, didn't take his eyes off Karen as he spoke. There was something in his steady gaze that made her breath catch. Not pity, but something deeper. Understanding, maybe. Abel was already tucking the whiskey under his arm, clearly satisfied with his profit. "She's yours, then." He gave Karen a rough shove toward Michael, already turning away. "Good riddance." The crowd's laughter started low, then swelled as Karen stumbled forward. She clutched her quilt tighter, fighting to keep her chin up as cruel comments flew. "Quite a load you're taking on there, mountain man. Hope your horse is strong. Better stock up on provisions." Michael's hand found her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. Without a word, he guided her through the pressing crowd, his bulk creating a path where there was none. Karen kept her eyes down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other until the trading post's heavy door creaked open, letting in a blast of mountain air that stung her eyes. The morning sun had barely crested the peaks, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of rose and gold. Karen's boots crunched in the fresh powder as Michael led her to a waiting wagon. It was well-maintained but plain, loaded with supplies and drawn by two sturdy mountain ponies whose breath steamed in the cold air. Michael helped her up onto the wooden seat, making sure her quilt stayed wrapped around her shoulders. The familiar weight of it was all she had left of home now. That and the secret sewn carefully into its lining, a deed her mother had hidden there before she died. The wagon's springs creaked as Michael settled beside her. He gathered the reins in his gloved hands but paused, turning to look at her fully for the first time. "You warm enough?" His voice was gruff but kind. Karen managed a small nod, not trusting her voice. Tears pressed hot against her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here, where her father or the others might see. Michael clicked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward. The trading post grew smaller behind them as they followed the snow-covered track toward the high country. Karen could feel the curious stares of the townsfolk following them, could almost hear the gossip starting already. How Abel May had finally rid himself of his burden of a daughter. How the strange mountain man must be desperate indeed to take such a wife. The wagon wheels cut fresh tracks in the pristine snow, heading up into the timber where the morning sun hadn't yet reached. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Karen pulled her quilt tighter, grateful for its warmth. Beside her, Michael sat straight and sure, handling the reins with quiet confidence. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the trading post, but somehow his silence felt more like respect than rejection. A jay called from the snow-laden pines, its harsh cry echoing off the mountainsides. Karen watched her breath cloud in the air, each inhale sharp with cold and the lingering sting of humiliation. The trading post disappeared around a bend, taking with it the last glimpse of the only life she'd known. The horses' hooves made a steady rhythm in the snow as they climbed higher. Into the mountains. Karen's tears finally spilled over, freezing on her cheeks before she could brush them away. She tried to do it discreetly, but Michael's low voice startled her. "No shame in crying," he said, eyes still on the trail ahead. "Oh, what happened back there? That wasn't right." His simple words broke something loose in Karen's chest. She pressed her face into her quilt, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the years of her father's cruel words, the townspeople's sideways glances, the weight of never being good enough, it all came pouring out in the safety of this stranger's quiet presence. Michael said nothing more, but he slowed the wagon's pace, letting her cry without hurry or judgment. The mountain air gradually dried her tears, leaving her feeling hollow, but somehow lighter. When she finally lifted her head, the sun had risen fully above the peaks, turning the snow-covered world to diamond brilliance. Karen smoothed her quilt with trembling hands, drawing strength from its familiar texture. Whatever lay ahead in the mountains with this quiet man couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. She straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next with the same resilience that had kept her going all these years. The wagon continued its steady climb into the high country, carrying them away from the cruel laughter and burning shame of the trading post. Behind them, their tracks began filling with fresh snow, erasing all evidence of their passing from the valley below. The wagon creaked steadily upward through the pristine snow, leaving the trading post and its cruel memories far behind. The morning sun did little to warm the biting mountain air. Karen huddled deeper into her quilt, trying to stop her teeth from chattering as another icy gust whipped past. Michael glanced sideways at her shivering form. Without a word, he pulled the wagon to a halt. The horses stamped their feet, their breath rising in thick clouds. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat and held it out to her. "Here." His voice was gruff but gentle. You need this more than I do." Karen stared at the offered coat, hesitating. "But won't you be cold? Been up here so long my blood runs thick as bears." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Go on, take it." With trembling fingers, Karen accepted the coat. It was still warm from his body, the wool rough but sturdy. She draped it over her quilt, immediately feeling the difference as it blocked the cutting wind. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels as they started moving again. Tears pricked at her eyes as she added, "Though I'm not worth even the whiskey my father got for me." Michael's hands tightened on the reins. He was quiet for so long that Karen thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and firm. "God don't make mistakes!" The simple statement hung in the cold air between them. Karen turned it over in her mind as the wagon continued its slow ascent through the deepening snow. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, as if her worth was something fixed and certain, determined by God himself rather than the cruel judgments of others. The short winter day was drawing to a close when Michael finally pulled the wagon to a stop near a frozen creek. The water's voice was muffled beneath thick ice, but Karen could still hear its faint song. Bare branches clattered overhead in the wind as Michael efficiently set up their camp, his movements speaking of long practice. "Best we rest here for the night," he explained, gathering fallen branches for a fire. "Trail gets tricky in the dark." Karen watched as he coaxed a small flame to life, carefully feeding it until it caught properly. The fire's warmth was welcome after the long, cold day. Michael pulled supplies from the wagon, jerky tough as leather, and a half loaf of bread that had seen better days. He offered her the larger portions without comment. Wrapped in her mother's quilt and Michael's coat, Karen settled close to the fire. The familiar weight of the quilt brought memories of her mother, her gentle hand stitching by lamplight, her clear voice raised in hymns that had filled their little house with joy. Without thinking, Karen began to hum one of those old songs, the melody rising soft and clear in the gathering dark. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. The wind howled through the trees, but here by the fire, Karen felt an unexpected peace settle over her. For all his quiet ways, Michael's presence was steadying. She realized with a start that she felt safer with this stranger than she ever had with her father. They slept in shifts through the night, Michael insisting on taking the longer watch. When dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold, they were already back on the trail. Hour after hour passed as the wagon climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, the wind sharper. Pine trees stood like sentinels against the sky, their branches heavy with snow. Finally, in the early afternoon, Michael guided the wagon around a bend and Karen caught her first glimpse of their destination. A line shack stood tucked against a stand of towering pines, its log walls weathered to a soft gray. Smoke stains marked where a chimney rose from the peaked roof, though no welcoming curl of smoke rose from it now. Michael helped her down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long journey. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a simple interior that spoke of long disuse. A layer of dust coated every surface. The hearth was cold and dark, filled with old ashes. The walls were bare except for a few essential tools, an axe, a saw, some traps. A narrow bed stood in one corner, its blankets neat but threadbare. Karen stepped inside, taking in her new home. The air was stale and cold, but she could see the cabin's potential. Without hesitation, she knelt by the fireplace and began carefully arranging kindling from the stack beside the hearth. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, building a proper base for the fire. Michael stood in the doorway, watching her. Work something flickered across his scarred face. Surprise, perhaps, at her calm acceptance of the task. Karen struck a match, touching it to the kindling. The dry wood caught quickly, hungry flames licking upward. Warmth began to spread through the cabin, pushing back the chill of disuse. Light filled the small space, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Karen fed the fire carefully, adding larger pieces of wood as the flames grew stronger. The familiar task centered her, gave her purpose. This might not be the life she had imagined for herself, but she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through all the years of her father's cruelty. Michael remained by the door, his expression thoughtful as he watched her work. The fire's glow softened the harsh lines of his face, caught the silver threads in his dark hair. For the first time since leaving the trading post, Karen felt something like hope stir in her chest. This cabin might be humble, but it could become a home, one where shame and mockery had no place. The flames crackled steadily now, their warm light filling every corner of the cabin. It was as if the very walls were coming alive again after weeks of darkness and silence. Karen sat back on her heels, satisfied with her work. When she glanced up, she found Michael still watching her, something like approval in his steady gaze. Outside, the wind sang through the pines and snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, warmth and light had taken hold. Karen smoothed her quilt across her lap, feeling the hidden deed sewn safely within its lining. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for now she had found shelter, not just from the mountain cold, but from the cruel world she'd left behind in the valley. The fire burned bright and steady, its flames a testament to new beginnings and the possibility of dignity restored. In its dancing light, two lonely souls began the careful work of building trust, finding their way forward one small kindness at a time. Morning crept into the cabin, like a shy visitor, pale sunlight spilling through the single window and casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Karen woke to the sound of Michael moving quietly through the cabin, his boots making soft, shuffling sounds on the wooden planks. She kept her eyes closed, listening as he added wood to the dying embers in the hearth, coaxing them back to life. When the door creaked open and closed again, Karen finally stirred. The air was crisp but not bitter thanks to the rekindled fire. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard floor near the hearth. Michael had insisted she take the narrow bed, but she declined, unwilling to displace him from his own rest. Through the window, she watched Michael's tall figure stride toward the woodpile, axe balanced easily on his shoulder. The steady rhythm of chopping soon filled the morning air. Karen wrapped her mother's quilt around her shoulders and rose, determination settling over her like a familiar cloak. This might not be the life she'd chosen, but she would make the best of it. Sunlight revealed the cabin's true state. Dust lay thick on every surface, dancing in the morning rays. Karen's eyes traveled slowly around the space, taking inventory. A cast-iron pot hung from a hook near the hearth, its surface dulled with age but still serviceable. A broken chair leaned against one wall, its seat splintered but its frame still strong. Wooden shelves lined one wall, their surfaces gray with accumulated dust. Karen set her quilt carefully aside and found a worn broom in the corner. She began to sweep, working methodically from one end of the cabin to the other. The familiar motion soothed her, and without thinking, she began to hum one of her mother's favorite hymns. The melody filled the small space, making it feel less empty somehow. Sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from a world of care. As she worked, her mind wandered to the contents of Michael's wagon. She'd noticed herbs hanging to dry in bundles, and she'd spotted a rabbit he'd snared the day before. The cast-iron pot caught her eye again, and an idea began to form. Outside, the chopping continued steady and strong. Karen worked quickly, finding water in a barrel outside and setting the pot to boil over the fire. She retrieved the rabbit and began to prepare it the way her mother had taught her, careful not to waste anything. From the wagon, she gathered dried herbs and the few vegetables Michael had stored away. The cabin slowly filled with the rich aroma of simmering stew. Karen added herbs with careful precision, remembering her mother's lessons about which plants brought healing and which added flavor. The familiar task absorbed her completely, and she barely noticed when the chopping outside finally ceased. The door opened, and Michael stepped inside, arms laden with split wood. He stopped abruptly, his nostrils flaring slightly as he breathed in the smell of the cooking stew. Something flickered across his face, surprise certainly, but something else too. Something that looked almost like longing. Smells like, He started, then fell silent, carefully stacking the wood near the hearth. Karen stirred the pot slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. "Like what?" she asked softly. Michael straightened, brushing wood chips from his shirt. "Like my mother's stew," he said finally. "Haven't tasted anything like that since she passed." Karen's heart squeezed at the quiet grief in his voice. "My mother taught me," she offered shyly, stirring the pot again. She knew all about herbs and cooking. Said a good meal could heal more than just hunger. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the bubbling pot. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Karen whispered, missing her mother's gentle presence with sudden sharpness. The day passed quietly as the stew simmered. Michael went out again to check his trap lines while Karen continued making the cabin more livable. She found clean claws in her bundle and wiped years of dust from the shelves. The broken chair proved simpler to fix than she'd expected. Just a few nails needed replacing. As evening drew near, Karen lit the oil lamp on the table. Its gentle light filled the cabin with a warm glow, softening the rough edges of their shared solitude. The stew was ready, its rich aroma making her stomach growl. She ladled portions into 2 tin bowls just as Michael returned from his last check of the horses. They sat across from each other at the small table, the lamplight flickering between them. Steam rose from their bowls, carrying the savory scent of herbs and tender meat. Michael took a careful spoonful, and Karen held her breath, watching his face. His eyes closed briefly as he tasted the stew. When they opened again, they held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "Been a long time since I had a proper meal like this," he said quietly. Karen ducked her head, pleased but uncomfortable with praise. The question that had been burning in her mind all day finally spilled out. "Why did you do it? Why did you buy me?" Michael set his spoon down slowly, considering her question. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair as he chose his words with care. "Because you deserved better than to be mocked," he said simply. "No child of God should be treated like cattle at auction." Tears pricked at Karen's eyes, but she blinked them back. They ate the rest of their meal in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. After the bowls were cleaned and put away, Karen settled near the fire with one of Michael's shirts she'd found needed mending. The familiar motion of needle and thread soothed her, and she found herself humming again as she worked. Michael sat in the newly repaired chair, cleaning his rifle with practiced movements. When the shirt was mended, Karen reached for her mother's quilt, drawing it around her shoulders. As she adjusted its folds, her fingers found an unfamiliar stiffness between the layers of fabric. Curious, she examined the section more closely and discovered a hidden pocket, carefully stitched into the quilt's lining. Heart beating faster, Karen glanced at Michael, but he was absorbed in his task. Carefully, she slipped her fingers into the hidden pocket and withdrew a folded document. The paper was yellowed with age, sealed with wax, and bearing an official stamp. Her hands trembled as she held it, understanding that this must be something of great importance for her mother to have hidden it so carefully. Questions crowded her mind, but instinct told her to keep this discovery to herself for now. Not knowing what the document might contain, she quickly tucked it back into its hiding place, smoothing the quilt as if nothing had happened. But her mind raced with possibilities and questions about what her mother might have concealed within these cherished folds. The fire popped loudly, making her jump. Michael looked up briefly from his work, his expression questioning. Karen gave him a small smile and bent her head over the quilt, pretending to examine its stitching. But her thoughts were fixed on the hidden document, and she resolved to examine it more closely when she had a private moment. The evening deepened around them, full of quiet sounds. The crackle of the fire, the whisper of the cleaning cloth on Michael's rifle, the soft rustle of the quilt as Karen folded it carefully. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the distance, but inside the cabin, two people who had begun the day as strangers found themselves sharing a space that was slowly beginning to feel like home. The first hint of dawn painted the sky in pale grays when Karen slipped quietly from the cabin. Her breath clouded in the frigid mountain air as she gathered Michael's work shirts and her few belongings that needed washing. The creek ran swift and dark between banks of snow, its surface steaming slightly in the bitter cold. Karen knelt at the water's edge, wincing as the icy water bit into her hands. She had done this countless times before at her father's ranch, but the altitude made the cold sharper here, more fierce. Still, she worked steadily, scrubbing each garment against the smooth rocks and wringing them out with reddened fingers. The sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when she heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind her. She turned to see Michael approaching, his arms full of freshly split wood. He paused, taking in her shivering form and the pile of wet clothes beside her. "You shouldn't be out here in this cold," he said, setting down his burden. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and stepped forward to drape it around her shoulders. The warmth of it enveloped her immediately, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Thank you," Karen whispered, pulling the coat closer. "But won't you be cold?" Michael shook his head, already turning back to his wood. "I'm used to it. Finish up quick now, before those clothes freeze solid." Back inside the cabin, Karen hung the wet garments near the hearth to dry while Michael built up the morning fire. Soon, the familiar aroma of coffee filled the small space as Karen sliced bread and set it to toast on the cooking grate. They sat together at the rough-hewn table, steam rising from their coffee cups. The bread was simple fare, but the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship made it feel like more. Karen's hand strayed to her mother's quilt, which lay folded nearby. Her heart quickened as she remembered her discovery from the night before. I found something," she said softly, looking up to meet Michael's steady gaze. "In my mother's quilt. There's a paper hidden inside." Michael set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. "What kind of paper?" Karen retrieved the quilt and carefully extracted the yellowed document from its hidden pocket. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it on the table between them. The official stamp and seal stood out clearly against the aged paper. Michael leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he read the carefully penned words. "This is a deed," he said, his voice rough with surprise. "Water rights to the entire valley, granted by territory surveyors." He looked up at Karen, his eyes wide. "This was in your mother's name?" Karen nodded, her throat tight. "I didn't even know she owned anything of her own. Father never mentioned." "He probably didn't know," Michael said, studying the document more closely. "This was signed and sealed 15 years ago. Do you understand what this means?" Karen shook her head, overwhelmed by the weight of what lay before them. "This valley's future depends on water rights," Michael explained gently. "Every ranch, every farm, every family that hopes to settle here, they all need legal access to water. With this deed, you hold the power to shape the valley's destiny." Karen's chest tightened with anxiety. "But who would respect such a claim from someone like me?" She gestured helplessly at herself. "I'm just the fat girl they all laughed at in the trading post." Michael's face hardened at the memory. "This is your rightful inheritance," he said firmly. "Your mother made sure it would pass to you. The law will recognize that claim, no matter what anyone thinks of the holder." Before Karen could respond, a knock at the door startled them both. Michael moved quickly to tuck the deed back into the quilt's hiding place while Karen went to answer. On the threshold stood Mrs. Templeton, a widow from down the valley, with her 2 young sons. The smaller boy's face was flushed with fever, and his mother's eyes were pinched with worry. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Mrs. Templeton said, "but word is you know something of healing herbs. My Tommy's been burning up since yesterday, and we've run out of medicine." Karen welcomed them inside, her heart going out to the sick child. "Please come sit by the fire," she said, already moving to gather her herbs. She had noticed wild willow growing near the creek and had dried some bark the day before, anticipating just such a need. While Michael spoke quietly with Mrs. Templeton, Karen prepared a tea with the willow bark, adding a touch of honey to make it more palatable for the young boy. Tommy sipped it carefully, making a face at the bitter taste, but drinking it all under his mother's watchful eye. "You've got your mother's touch with medicines," Mrs. Templeton said softly as Karen checked Tommy's forehead. "She helped birth both my boys, you know. Used to say you had the gift too." Karen blinked back sudden tears, touched by this connection to her mother she hadn't known about. "I didn't realize you knew her." Mrs. Templeton smiled gently. "Oh yes, she was well loved in these parts." She paused, glancing at Michael, who had taken the boys outside to see his horses. "Folks are talking, you know. Not like before at the trading post. That was cruel business. But now they're saying how you've brought light back to this cabin, how you help those in need without question." Karen ducked her head, unused to kind words from anyone but Michael. Mrs. Templeton reached out and squeezed her hand. "You're making your own way here, child. Don't let anyone tell you different." After the Templetons left, promising to return if Tommy's fever didn't break, Karen stood at the window watching their wagon disappear down the snowy track. The afternoon light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the valley. Michael came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "If word of that deed spreads," he said quietly, "your father will come looking for you." Karen's hands clenched in her skirts. "I know," she whispered. "We'll need to be careful," Michael continued. "That document could bring out the worst in people. But remember, you're not alone anymore." Karen looked up at him, seeing the quiet strength in his scarred face and steady eyes. In just a few days, this mountain man, who had seemed so frightening at first, had become her protector, her friend, and perhaps something more she wasn't ready to name yet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and carrying the lonely cry of a distant wolf. But inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Karen felt stronger than she had in years. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity, not as the girl who had been sold in shame, but as the woman who carried her mother's legacy in a quilt's hidden folds. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard as Michael hitched the horses to the wagon. 2 days of peaceful routine had settled over the cabin, but their supplies were running low. Karen watched from the doorway, her mother's quilt draped over her arm, as Michael checked the harnesses one final time. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Inside, her stomach churned at the thought of facing the townsfolk's stares again. Michael paused, studying her face. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "I know," Karen replied, stepping out into the crisp morning air. "But I can't hide up here forever. Besides, we need flour, and you don't know which kind makes the best biscuits." A ghost of a smile crossed Michael's weathered face. He offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat, then settled beside her. The horses' breath steamed in the cold as they started down the mountain trail. The wagon creaked and swayed over the rutted path. Karen clutched her quilt close, taking comfort in its familiar weight. After a while, Michael broke his usual silence. "First time I drove a wagon like this," he said quietly, "was during the war. Supply runs mostly, but sometimes." He trailed off, his hands tightening on the reins. Karen watched his profile against the winter sky. "You served in the war?" Michael nodded, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "4th Virginia Infantry. Saw things no man should see. Did things that—" He swallowed hard. "Well, reckon that's why I came out here after. Needed the quiet. Needed to find some peace." "Did you?" Karen asked softly. "Find peace?" "Some days." He glanced at her. "More lately." The town came into view around midday, smoke rising from chimneys against the gray sky. Karen's heart beat faster as they approached the mercantile. A cluster of women stood gossiping on the boardwalk, their conversation faltering as Michael helped Karen down from the wagon. Inside the store, the familiar smell of coffee and leather goods filled the air. Karen kept her head high as she moved between the shelves, selecting flour and other necessities. She could feel the weight of curious stares, hear the whispered comments. A child's frightened cry cut through the murmurs. Near the counter, a young mother struggled with a wailing toddler who had fallen and bumped his head. Without thinking, Karen moved closer and began to sing softly, an old hymn her mother had used to comfort her. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her clear, gentle voice filled the store. The child's cries softened to hiccups as he turned to watch her. The whispers died away. Karen kept singing, focused only on the little boy's tear-stained face. When the song ended, the silence held a different quality. The child's mother gave Karen a grateful smile. Two older women exchanged glances, nodding with something like respect. Karen gathered her purchases, tucking them carefully into her basket while keeping the quilt close. At the blacksmith's shop, heat from the forge drove back the winter chill. While Michael negotiated for nails, Karen waited outside, watching snow begin to fall. A few passing townspeople nodded to her, small gestures but worlds away from the cruel laughter of days before. The sun was setting by the time they started the long climb home. Golden light painted the snow-covered peaks as their wagon wound its way up the mountain trail. Karen found herself humming the hymn again, her voice carrying on the clear air. "That was a kindness you showed that child," Michael said after a while. "Seems folks noticed." Karen wrapped the quilt tighter against the evening chill. "I just did what needed doing." "But Michael," she hesitated. "Do you think, could God really use someone like me? After everything?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horses around a bend in the trail. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. "Karen, he already is. I've seen it these past days. The way you tend to people's needs without judgment, how you bring light wherever you go. The Lord don't make mistakes, remember?" Tears pricked at Karen's eyes, but they were healing tears. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence as dusk deepened around them. The cabin windows glowed warmly when they finally arrived, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd banked the morning's fire. Michael helped Karen down from the wagon, his hands steady and strong. Inside, they built up the fire together, its light chasing away the shadows. Karen set about preparing a simple supper while Michael brought in the supplies. The familiar domestic routine felt right somehow, as if they'd been doing this dance for years instead of days. Later, they sat before the hearth, the fire's warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Karen worked on mending one of Michael's shirts while he cleaned his rifle, the peaceful silence broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood. "Thank you," Karen said softly. "For today. For everything." Michael looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "No need for thanks between friends." Friends. The words settled in Karen's heart like a seed taking root. She smiled and returned to her mending, unaware of the danger lurking just outside. In the darkness beyond the cabin's warm circle of lamplight, Abel May stood in the shadows of the pines. He'd followed their wagon from town, his heart burning with bitterness and greed. When he'd spotted Karen carrying that quilt, his dead wife's quilt, memories had stirred. Memories of his wife's secretivas before she died, of papers she'd hidden away. Now he watched through the window as his daughter sat by the fire, that same quilt folded carefully beside her. His eyes glittered with malice in the darkness. Whatever secret that quilt held, he meant to have it, and the power that came with it. But for now, he melted back into the shadows, leaving only footprints in the snow that would be gone by morning. Dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Karen moved quietly through her morning routine, stoking the banked fire until flames danced merrily in the hearth. The familiar scent of coffee soon filled the small space, mingling with the aroma of frying bacon and fresh biscuits. Through the frost-touched window, she watched Michael examining the cabin's roof. Recent storms had loosened some of the shingles, and he'd insisted on making repairs before the next snowfall. His tall figure moved steadily across the weathered planks, hammer echoing through the crisp morning air. Karen measured flour into a bowl, adding a pinch of salt before working in cold butter with practiced fingers. As she worked, she began to hum softly, one of her mother's favorite hymns. The melody rose naturally from her heart, growing stronger until her clear voice filled the cabin. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. The familiar words brought comfort, reminding her of peaceful moments watching her mother cook and sing. Her voice soared through the verses, pure and sweet in the morning, quiet. Outside, Michael paused in his work, hammer stilled as he listened. The sound of Karen's singing stirred something deep in his battle-scarred heart. It had been so long since these walls had heard anything but silence. Now, they seemed to gather her song, holding it like a precious thing. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, letting the melody wash over him. Miles away in town, a very different scene unfolded. Abel May burst through the sheriff's office door, his face flushed with rage. Sheriff Thompson looked up from his desk, weathered features settling into careful neutrality. My good-for-nothing daughter's got stolen property, Abel bellowed, slamming his fist on the desk. Water rights that belong to me, you've got to help me get them back. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying Abel's angry face. Those are serious accusations, May. You got any proof these rights were stolen? They were my wife's papers, Abel spat. Karen took them when she died, hid them in that cursed quilt of hers. They're mine by rights. Now hold on, Sheriff Thompson said, raising a calming hand. Without proper documentation, I can't just go seizing property. The law's got procedures. Damn your procedures! Abel's face twisted with fury. That mountain man bought my daughter like cattle. You telling me that's legal? The sheriff's eyes hardened. Seems to me you're the one who put her up for sale, May. Folk are still talking about that display at the trading post. Abel's hands clenched into fists. I'll handle this myself, he snarled, turning toward the door. Don't need no tin star telling me what's mine. May, the sheriff called after him. You do anything foolish, you'll answer to me. But Abel was already gone, leaving only the bang of the door and a bitter chill in the air. Back at the cabin, the morning had settled into quiet industry. Karen pulled a fresh batch of biscuits from the oven while Michael came in from his roof repairs, brushing snow from his coat. They sat down to breakfast together, sunlight streaming through the windows to pool on the rough wooden table. Karen noticed Michael's gaze repeatedly drawn to her mother's quilt, carefully folded on the bench nearby. His expression held something she couldn't quite read, longing mixed with uncertainty. Something on your mind? She asked softly. Michael was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in scarred hands. Been thinking, he finally said, about family, about possibilities. He looked down at his own rough fingers. War took a lot from me, left its mark inside and out. Never thought I'd have a chance at the kind of life other men have. A home. Children. His voice grew quieter. A wife who could look at these scars without flinching. Karen's heart beat faster, a blush warming her cheeks. And I never thought any man could look at me and see something worthy, she admitted. All my life, people only saw my size. Called me names. Laughed. She smoothed her skirt with trembling fingers. Even my own father couldn't bear to look at me. They were blind, Michael said firmly. Couldn't see past their own ugly hearts to recognize what God made beautiful. Before Karen could respond, a knock at the door announced their evening visitors. Mrs. Templeton and her sons had brought a warm apple pie, while the Cooper family from the next valley over carried fresh eggs and curiosity about their new neighbor. Karen welcomed them all, setting extra places at the table while Michael added logs to the fire. Soon the cabin rang with conversation and laughter. The children played checkers by the hearth while the adults shared news and stories over steaming cups of coffee. Mrs. Templeton praised Karen's cooking, while Mrs. Cooper marveled at how homey the once bare cabin had become. Their genuine warmth helped ease the lingering ache of rejection Karen had carried so long. "We've missed having neighbors up this way," Mrs. Cooper said, helping to clear the dishes. "Michael's been alone too long. Does a body good to have family close by." As the evening drew to a close, their guests bundled up against the falling snow. Lanterns bobbed through the darkness as they made their way home, calling back cheerful goodnights. Karen stood in the doorway, watching until the lights disappeared into the swirling white. Michael stepped out to check the horses one last time before bed. In the fresh snow, his keen eyes caught something that made his jaw tighten. Hoofprints circling the cabin, partially filled with new fallen snow. Someone had been watching them. He studied the tracks carefully, noting their depth and direction. And these weren't from their dinner guests who had approached openly from the main trail. These spoke of secrecy and ill intent. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back. Inside, Karen was humming again as she banked the fire for the night, unaware of the danger circling ever closer. Michael's heart clenched at the thought of anything threatening the peace they'd found here. But he recognized the signs. A storm was gathering, and not just the one painting the sky with snow. The tracks told their own story. Abel May had found them. And soon, Michael knew, they would have to face whatever violence the bitter man brought with him. He made one final circuit of the cabin, checking doors and windows before returning inside, where warmth and light still held the darkness at bay. For now, at least, they were safe. But tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and Michael intended to be ready. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of rose and gold. The morning air hung thick with tension, like the stillness before a storm. Frost had traced delicate patterns across the cabin windows overnight, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney into the pale sky. Michael stood at the rough-hewn table, checking his ammunition and sliding his revolver into its worn leather holster. His movements were deliberate, practiced from years of frontier living. "Need to ride into town," he said quietly. "We're running low on nails and salt." Karen nodded, her hands busy kneading dough for the day's bread. "Be careful," she said, trying to hide the worry in her voice. Ever since they'd spotted those mysterious tracks around the cabin, every journey felt weighted with risk. Michael shrugged into his heavy coat, adjusting the collar against the bitter morning chill. "I'll be back before sundown." He paused at the door, watching Karen work. The sight of her steady presence in his once-empty cabin still filled him with quiet wonder. The crunch of his boots in the snow faded as he led his horse from the stable, tacked up and mounted. Karen watched through the window until horse and rider disappeared down the snow-covered trail toward town. Alone in the cabin, Karen fell into her morning routine. She swept the plank floors, hung fresh herbs to dry from the rafters, and set the bread to rise near the warmth of the fire. Her mother's quilt lay carefully folded on the bed, the precious deed still safely hidden within its stitches. The morning passed quietly until a frantic pounding at the door startled Karen from her work. Her heart leaped into her throat. But when she opened the door, she found Mrs. Templeton, face flushed with fear and worry. "Karen, please," the widow gasped, clutching at Karen's arm. "It's Tommy. His fever's back, worse than before." "I don't know what to do." Karen didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and her mother's medicine bag, filled with dried herbs and tinctures. "Show me," she said, following Mrs. Templeton into the biting cold. They hurried through the snow to the Templeton homestead, their skirts leaving trailing patterns in the fresh powder. Inside the small cabin, young Tommy lay on his bed, face flushed with fever, his younger brother watching anxiously from the corner. Karen set to work immediately, her movements sure and practiced. She felt Tommy's forehead, the skin burned beneath her touch. His breathing came in short, labored gasps. "How long has he been like this?" Karen asked, already digging through her medicine bag. "Since dawn," Mrs. Templeton wrung her hands. "He was fine yesterday, then woke burning up. I've tried everything I know." Karen pulled out dried willow bark and other herbs, quickly preparing a medicinal tea. While it steeped, she soaked claws in cool water, laying them gently across Tommy's forehead and chest. Throughout the long day, Karen never left Tommy's side. She changed the cool cloths whenever they grew warm, spooned tiny sips of healing tea between his cracked lips, and sang hymns in her clear, strong voice. The familiar melodies seemed to soothe him, his restless movements calming when she sang. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice filled the small cabin with hope as she dabbed Tommy's face with a fresh, cool cloth. Mrs. Templeton joined in softly, tears tracking down her tired face. Hours passed. The sun crept across the sky, shadows lengthening across the cabin floor. Karen prayed aloud, her voice steady and sure while continuing to tend to the sick child. Mrs. Templeton and the younger brother huddled nearby, adding their own quiet amens. As evening approached, Tommy's breathing finally began to ease. Karen felt his forehead again. The burning heat had lessened. When his eyes fluttered open, clear and focused for the first time all day, Mrs. Templeton burst into grateful tears. "The fever's broken," Karen announced, relief flooding through her own tired body. She showed Mrs. Templeton how to prepare more of the willow bark tea, just in case it was needed again. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads of the valley. Neighbors who had come to check on Tommy's condition hurried to share the news. Karen May, the girl they had once mocked, had saved the Templeton boy's life. The story grew with each telling, how she had worked tirelessly, how her singing had brought peace to the sick child, how her gentle hands and healing knowledge had turned death away from their community. The sun was setting when Karen finally made her way home, exhaustion dragging at her steps. The cabin windows glowed with welcoming lamplight, and when she pushed open the door, she found Michael waiting. He stood from his chair by the fire, concern and pride mingling in his expression. "Heard about Tommy Templeton," he said softly, taking her shawl and hanging it to dry. "Words all over the valley about what you did." Karen sank into a chair, her legs trembling with fatigue. "I only did what anyone would do," she murmured. "What my mother taught me." Michael shook his head, setting a plate of warm cornbread before her. "No, Karen. You did what only you could do. This valley needs you. These people need you. They're starting to see what I saw that day at the trading post." Karen broke off a piece of cornbread, but her hand trembled slightly. "Abel won't stop," she whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her even through the day's events. "When he learns about the deed, about people accepting me here." Her voice trailed off. Michael moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "Then we face him together," he said firmly. The simple words held the weight of a vow. They sat in companionable silence as the fire crackled in the hearth, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the gathering darkness. The storm clouds rolled in from the mountains, gradually cloaking the valley in white. The silence between them was full of unspoken promise, of protection, of belonging, of a future neither had dared imagine before finding each other. Karen's mother's quilt lay across her lap, its hidden deed representing not just water rights now, but the possibility of a real home, a true community. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows and driving the snow harder against the glass. But inside, warmth and light held firm against the growing storm. The storm descended upon the highlands with a fury that turned the world white. Wind howled through the pines, driving snow against the cabin walls in thick sheets. Inside, Karen stoked the fire higher as Michael secured the last shutter against the gathering tempest. "Looks like we're in for a long one," Michael said, brushing snow from his coat. His weathered face showed concern as he peered through a crack in the shutters. "Could be trapped here for days." Karen nodded, already mentally cataloging their supplies. The pantry held enough dried beans, flour, and salt pork to last them through a siege. The woodpile by the hearth would keep them warm. "We'll manage," she said softly, setting water to boil for coffee. The first day passed slowly, marked by the steady drumming of snow against the roof. They fell into a quiet rhythm, making the most of their confinement. Karen pulled out her sewing basket, working by lamplight to mend Michael's worn shirts. Her nimble fingers patched holes and reinforced seams while Michael cleaned his rifle and repaired a broken chair. "Where'd you learn to sew so fine?" Michael asked, watching her careful stitches. Karen smiled, remembering. "Mama taught me. Said a woman's hands should know how to both heal and create." She held up one of his shirts, examining her work. "These'll last you another winter now." Michael's expression softened at the mention of her mother. "Tell me about her," he asked quietly. Karen's hands stilled in her lap. She was beautiful, she began slowly. Not like other women thought of beauty. She was round like me, but she carried herself like a queen. Said God made us all different on purpose. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. She could sing like an angel, knew every herb that grew in these mountains, and never turned away anyone who needed help. "Sounds like someone else I know," Michael said gently. Karen blushed, ducking her head back to her sewing. The second day dawned just as wild, the storm showing no signs of weakening. They shared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. Then Michael surprised Karen by pulling out a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets from his saddlebag. "Found this in a creek bed years ago," he explained, almost sheepishly. "Used it to teach myself reading proper-like during lonely nights." Karen's eyes lit up. She reached for her mother's quilt, carefully opening a hidden pocket different from the one holding the deed. From it, she drew out several pages of Bible verses, lovingly stitched into fabric. "Mama sewed these when she was sick, Mamaite," Karen explained. Said, as long as we had God's word, we'd never truly be alone. They spent the morning taking turns reading aloud, Michael's deep voice rolling through Shakespeare's love poems, Karen's clear tones bringing scripture to life. The howling wind outside seemed to fade away as they shared these precious words. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Karen began to hum softly while preparing their supper. The melody, an old hymn, filled the small space with warmth. To her surprise, Michael's deep voice joined in, rough but sincere. Their first attempt at harmony was far from perfect. Michael's timing faltered, and Karen lost her place trying not to laugh. Soon, they were both chuckling at their own clumsy efforts. "Reckon we need some practice," Michael said, grinning. "Reckon we do," Karen agreed, her eyes twinkling. "But it's a fine start." The third day brought a gradual calming of the storm. Sunlight began to pierce the clouds, creating diamond sparkles in the fresh snow. Inside, Michael had been unusually quiet all morning, lost in thought as he watched Karen move about the cabin. Finally, as afternoon light filtered through the shutters, he spoke. "Karen," he said softly, "these past days, seeing you here, hearing your voice, watching you make this place a real home." He paused, searching for words. "I never thought I'd find this kind of peace after the war. Figured I was too scarred, too broken for anything good." Karen set down her work, heart beating faster at the emotion in his voice. "But you," he continued, "you've brought light back into my world, your strength, your kindness, even after everything you've been through." He moved closer, taking her hands in his. "I find myself falling in love with you more each day." Tears welled in Karen's eyes. "How can you say that?" she whispered. I'm not what men want. I'm too big, too plain. Father always said." "Your father was wrong," Michael cut in firmly. "You're my goddess of the high country, Karen May, the way you heal people, how you sing like an angel, how you make this cabin feel like heaven itself." His voice grew husky with emotion. "You're the most beautiful soul I've ever known." Karen's tears fell freely now, but her face was radiant with joy and disbelief. Never had anyone spoken to her with such reverence, such love. The last rays of sunset painted the cabin in gold as Michael slowly knelt before her. His hands trembled slightly as he held hers, but his voice was steady. Karen May, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? When spring comes and the snow melts, I want to stand before God and our neighbors and pledge my life to yours." For a moment, Karen couldn't speak past the emotion filling her heart. This man, this good, strong, gentle man, wanted her as his wife, not as a servant or a burden, but as a true partner. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Yes." "Oh yes, Michael." He rose and gathered her in his arms, holding her close as if she were the most precious thing in the world. They stood together as the light faded, watching the fire burn low in the hearth. Their clasped hands spoke of promises, of a future neither had dared dream of before. The embers glowed softly, casting a warm light over the cabin, their cabin, soon to be their home in truth. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world renewed and sparkling with possibility. Inside, two hearts beat as one, filled with the miracle of finding love in the most unexpected places. In the quiet of their shared joy, Karen began to hum again. This time, when Michael's voice joined hers, their harmony was perfect. The morning after the storm broke crystal clear, with sunlight dancing off fresh snow that blanketed the valley. Michael rose before dawn, his breath visible in the cold air as he surveyed the land around their cabin. His experienced eyes picked out spots where the building could grow. A new room here, a wider porch there, space enough for the family he now dared to dream about. The sharp ring of his axe soon echoed through the trees. Each stroke bit deep into pine logs, every swing driven by purpose. Michael had lived alone for so long that the simple act of building for two filled his heart with quiet joy. When the sun climbed higher, he paused to wipe his brow, studying the neat pile of logs taking shape. Inside the cabin, Karen hummed as she worked bread dough with strong, sure hands. The familiar motions that brought comfort: fold, press, turn. Through the window, she watched Michael's steady progress with the logs, and her cheeks warmed at the thought that he labored for their future together. The smell of baking bread soon filled the small space, making it feel more like home with each passing hour. Shortly before noon, hoofbeats approached. Karen's hands stilled in their work, but Michael's calm voice called out, "It's just the Templeton boys." She relaxed, wiping flour from her apron as two young men appeared around the bend. "Miss Karen," the younger Templeton called out, dismounting. "Ma sent us with eggs, said to congratulate. You proper," his older brother added, word spreading about the engagement. Folks are mighty pleased. Karen invited them in for fresh bread and coffee, her heart lifting at their easy acceptance. The boys spoke of their mother's joy at the news, how she'd declared it about time Michael found himself a good woman. They left with warm bread wrapped in cloth, promising to bring their mother to visit soon. Throughout the afternoon, more neighbors arrived. The Hansen sisters brought preserves, old Widow Cooper offered a hand-pieced quilt square, and even gruff Mr. Peterson stopped by with a basket of late apples. Each visitor treated Karen with genuine warmth, erasing bit by bit the shame of that terrible day at the trading post. As the sun began to set, Michael and Karen hitched the wagon for their first trip to church together. The little valley church stood humble but welcoming, its wooden cross catching the last rays of daylight. Pastor Whitlow met them at the door, his kind eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure. "Welcome, welcome," he boomed, ushering them inside. "I've been hoping you two would come see me." He led them to a rough-hewn pew, settling in beside them. "Now then, about this wedding. I'd be honored to officiate if you'll have me." Karen's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "We'd be blessed, Pastor," she whispered. Michael squeezed her hand gently. The pastor nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "God's hand is clear in this match," he declared. "Love that grows from kindness and respect. That's the kind that lasts." He opened his Bible, marking passages for the ceremony while they discussed dates and arrangements. Meanwhile, in town, a very different meeting was taking place. 3 men in fine Eastern suits stepped down from the afternoon stage, brushing trail dust from their sleeves. These were the railroad agents, men who had bought and sold their way across territories, leaving broken promises in their wake. The agents made straight for the saloon, where Abel May sat nursing his usual whiskey. Their approach was careful, calculated. They bought him drinks, praised his cattle operation, and slowly steered the conversation toward water rights. "Shame about that valley deed," the lead agent said smoothly. "Valuable land like that should be in capable hands." He slid a paper across the sticky table. Railroads prepared to pay handsomely for the right signature. Abel's bloodshot eyes fixed on the number written there. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. "Ain't my signature you need," he growled. "My dead wife's quilt holds the deed, and my worthless daughter took it when that mountain man bought her." The agent's eyebrows rose. "Bought her, you say?" He exchanged glances with his companions. "Well now, that's interesting. Property rights between father and daughter can be complicated. Perhaps we could help each other." Abel's face darkened with cruel purpose. "Reckon we could," he said, draining his glass. "Give me till week's end. I'll get you that deed." Later that night, Abel met with 3 men behind the livery stable. Hard cases he knew from cattle drives, men who asked no questions when pay was good. He passed them a bottle and laid out his plan. They would wait until Michael left for supplies, then pay his daughter a visit. The deed would be found and Karen would learn the price of defying her father. Up at the cabin, unaware of the shadow falling across their future, Karen and Michael sat close together by lamplight. The evening air carried a hint of spring despite the lingering snow. They shared the day's bread as they talked, voices soft with contentment. "Pastor says we could marry when the wild iris blooms," Karen said, her fingers working at her mending. "That's barely 6 weeks away." Michael nodded, watching her with tender eyes. "Gives me time to get the cabin ready. Thought we might add a proper bedroom, maybe a bigger kitchen for all your baking." Karen set down her sewing, face glowing. "And a porch where we can sit of an evening, watch the sunset together?" "Anything you want," Michael promised. "Thought we might plant a garden too come spring. Herbs for your healing work, vegetables for winter storing." "And flowers," Karen added softly. "Mama always said a home needs flowers to make it smile." They fell quiet, imagining the life they would build. Karen pictured children running through mountain meadows, their laughter echoing off distant peaks. Michael saw Sunday mornings in church, Karen's voice lifting in song beside him, their family filling a whole pew. "Never thought I'd have this," Karen whispered, breaking the silence. "After what Father did, I believed him when he said no one would want me." Michael took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Your father was wrong about everything that matters. You're a blessing to this whole valley. The way you help folks, how you bring light wherever you go." Karen leaned against his shoulder, peace settling over her like a warm blanket. For the first time in her life, she felt truly at home, truly valued. The future stretched before them bright with promise. Yet even as they planned and dreamed, Michael couldn't shake a growing unease. Years of mountain living had honed his instincts for danger. Something in the air felt wrong, like the stillness before storm breaks. He found himself checking his rifle more often, studying the trail through the trees for signs of visitors. The peaceful evening continued, filled with quiet talk of wedding feasts and hymns they would sing. But Michael's warrior senses remained alert, reading signs only he could see. A storm was coming, not of snow and wind, but of human greed and violence. He silently vowed that no harm would reach Karen, no matter what price he had to pay. For now that the Obersaus, he kept his concerns quiet, not wanting to shadow Karen's joy. They sat together in the lamp's warm glow, their love a bright shelter against gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring what it would did. The night was for dreaming, of iris blooms and wedding bells, of children's laughter and a porch built for two. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight sparkling off fresh snow. Michael stood at the cabin door, adjusting his coat and checking his ammunition. "I'll be back before noon," he said, touching Karen's cheek gently. "Just need those nails to finish the bedroom frame." Karen nodded, already rolling up her sleeves to begin the day's baking. "Be careful on that trail," she called after him. "Ice might be treacherous after yesterday's thaw." The sound of Michael's horse faded into the distance as Karen measured flour into her mother's old mixing bowl. She hummed softly while working, her hands moving with practiced ease through the familiar motions of bread making. The cabin filled with peaceful morning sounds, fire crackling, spoons clinking against bowls, her quiet singing. Her mother's cherished quilt lay draped over the chair nearby, a comfort in its familiar presence. Karen glanced at it occasionally as she worked, thinking of the precious deed hidden within its folds. The morning light caught the careful stitching, highlighting patterns her mother had sewn with such love. The first batch of dough was just beginning to rise when she heard hoofbeats approaching, too many for just Michael returning. Karen's hand stilled in the flour as the sounds grew closer. Her heart began to pound. The cabin door burst open with a crash. Abel May stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. Two rough-looking men flanked him, their expressions hard and cold. Karen recognized them from cattle drives, the kind of men who asked no questions when paid. "Well, if it ain't my worthless daughter," Abel sneered, filling the doorway with his bulk. "Playing house with that mountain man while stealing what's rightfully mine." Karen straightened her spine, brushing flour from her hands. "I'm not yours anymore, Father. You sold me, remember?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. "You have no right to be here." Abel's face darkened. "No right?" He stalked forward, boots leaving muddy tracks on her clean floor. "That deed belongs to me. Your mother had no business hiding it away." Karen's eyes darted to the quilt. Abel followed her glance, his mouth curving in a cruel smile. "So it is in there. Boys, get that quilt." "No!" Karen lunged for the chair, snatching up the precious quilt and clutching it to her chest. "This was Mama's." "You can't have it." Abel's hand shot out, catching her hard across the face. The force of the blow sent Karen stumbling backward. Her head struck the edge of the table, making her vision swim. The quilt was torn from her grasp as she struggled to stay upright. "Bind her hands," Abel ordered, examining the quilt with greedy eyes. "Can't have her running to warn that mountain man?" The two men grabbed Karen's arms, twisting them behind her back. She fought against their grip, but they were too strong. Rough rope bit into her wrists as they tied her securely. "Please," she begged as they dragged her toward the door. "Father, don't do this. The deed belongs to the valley, not the railroad." Abel's only response was to shove her forward, making her stumble down the cabin steps into the snow. Karen's bare feet burned. With cold, but she continued struggling, refusing to go quietly. The commotion drew attention. From the nearest homestead, the Templeton boys came running. "Miss Karen," the younger one shouted. "What's happening?" "Stay back." Abel drew his pistol, firing a warning shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed off the mountains. "This is family business. Any man interferes, he'll get worse than that." More neighbors appeared, drawn by the gunshot. They gathered at a cautious distance, faces tight with concern and anger. But Abel's pistol kept them at bay as his men forced Karen onto a horse. "Somebody ride for Michael," Karen heard Mrs. Templeton call. "Tell him what's happened." But Abel was already mounting up, the precious quilt stuffed into his saddlebag. "Anyone follows us, she'll pay the price," he warned, waving the pistol for emphasis. Then he spurred his horse, leading their small party south at a gallop. Karen twisted in the saddle, catching one last glimpse of her home. Smoke still rising peacefully from the chimney, half-kneaded bread abandoned on the table, neighbors standing helpless in the yard. Then, they plunged into the trees, and everything she loved vanished from sight. Miles away, Michael was already turning toward home, his wagon loaded with supplies. Something felt wrong, a shadow on his heart he couldn't explain. When he spotted smoke rising from the direction of the cabin, his unease deepened. That was too much smoke for Karen's usual cooking fire. He snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. The wagon swayed dangerously on the icy trail, but Michael barely noticed. His entire focus was fixed on that column of smoke, rising like an accusation against the morning sky. As he rounded the final bend, his worst fears were confirmed. The cabin yard was turned up with hoofprints. Neighbors gathered in anxious clusters. And Karen, his beloved Karen, was nowhere in sight. Michael leaped from the wagon before it fully stopped. "What happened?" he demanded, though his heart already knew. "Abel May," Mrs. Templeton said, her voice shaking with anger. "He came with 2 hired thugs. They took Karen and the quilt, headed south, toward town. We couldn't stop them. He had a gun." Michael knelt in the trampled snow, reading the story, written there. Multiple horses, signs of struggle, Karen's bare footprints in the snow. His experienced eyes took in every detail. His hands clenched into fists as he noticed drops of blood staining the white ground. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Give me strength to find her. Keep her safe until I come." The prayer came through clenched teeth, more warrior's oath than gentle petition. Rising swiftly, he strode to the cabin. Inside, he grabbed his rifle and ammunition, strapping on his gun belt with practiced movements. The sight of Karen's abandoned baking, flour scattered across the table, dough half-kneaded made his heart twist with rage and fear. "We'll help," the elder Templeton boy offered. "We can gather men, form a search party." Michael shook his head. "No time. Abel's desperate enough to hurt her if he's cornered. I'll move faster alone." He checked his rifle one final time. "But ride to town. Alert the sheriff. Tell him Abel May's stolen both his daughter and legal property." Swinging into his saddle, Michael paused only long enough to study the trail leading south. The signs were clear. 3 riders pushing hard, heading for town. If he rode carefully, he could follow their path easily enough. "Michael," Mrs. Templeton called as he prepared to ride. "Bring our girl home safe." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then urged his horse forward. The animal sensed his urgency, settling into a ground-eating lope that would eat up the miles without tiring too quickly. As he rode, Michael's mind was full of Karen, her gentle strength, her beautiful voice, the way she had brought light and warmth back into his solitary life. He remembered her standing brave and tall despite her father's cruelty, remembered her hands gentle with the sick, remembered her smile when he proposed. The thought of her bound and frightened, at the mercy of a father who had already betrayed her once, made his blood run cold. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think clearly. Abel would be heading for town, probably to meet with those railroad men. That meant Michael had time. Not much, but enough if he rode smart. The trail wound south through stands of pine and across small meadows. Michael read the signs as he rode. Here they had stopped briefly. There they had pushed their horses harder. The tracks were clear in the fresh snow, leading him onward like a ribbon of vengeance across the landscape. He would find her. No matter what it took, he would find her and bring her home. And Abel May would learn what happened to men who dared harm what Michael Boone loved. The barn doors creaked shut with a heavy thud. Karen stumbled in the dim light, her bound wrists making it difficult to keep her balance on the straw-covered floor. Her father's ranch hadn't changed since she'd left. The same musty smell of hay, the same rusty tools hanging on weathered walls, the same broken ladder leading to the hayloft. But everything felt different now. This place was no longer home. It was a prison. Abel May paced before her, the precious quilt clutched in his weathered hands. Lantern light caught the wrinkles in his face, deepening them into harsh lines. His 2 hired men lounged against the barn wall, watching with dark amusement. "You always were stubborn," Abel spat, shaking the quilt at her. "Just like your mother. She thought she could outsmart me too, hiding this deed away where I wouldn't find it." Karen lifted her chin, though her cheek still stung from where he'd struck her. Mama knew what you'd do with those water rights. She protected them for everyone in the valley, not just yourself. Protected them? Abel laughed harshly. Look around, girl. This land's dying. The railroad's offering good money for those rights, enough to make this ranch what it should be. All you have to do is sign them over. No. The word came out quiet, but firm. Abel's face darkened. He strode forward, grabbing her arm roughly. You think that mountain man's coming to save you? He bought you fair and square, just like livestock. That's all you are to him. Karen met her father's gaze steadily. Michael Boone is twice the man you are. He saw worth in me when you saw only shame. The slap came fast, snapping her head to the side. Karen tasted blood in her mouth but didn't cry out. Boss, one of the hired men shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we ought to ease up a bit. She is your daughter. Shut your mouth, Abel rounded on him. I'm paying you to watch, not talk. He turned back to Karen, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You'll sign those rights over, girl. One way or another. Then you'll have a long wait, Karen replied. She moved carefully to sit on a hay bale, arranging her skirts as best she could with bound hands. I won't help you steal from our neighbors. Abel cursed, storming toward the barn doors. We'll see how stubborn you feel after a night in the cold. No food, no water until you agree to sign. The doors slammed shut. Karen heard the heavy bar drop into place, followed by her father's boots crunching away through the snow. The two hired men remained outside. She could see their shadows moving past the cracks in the weathered boards. Darkness crept through the barn as the lantern burned low. Karen shivered, but it wasn't just from the cold. Her head ached where it had struck the table and her wrists were raw from the rope. But worse was the knowledge that her father would do anything to get those water rights. The railroad's money had poisoned his mind even more than she'd feared. As night deepened, coyotes began their mournful chorus in the distant hills. Karen closed her eyes, remembering peaceful evenings in Michael's cabin, the warmth of the hearth, the gentle way he looked at her. Would he find her? Could he even track them through the snow? Almost without thinking, she began to hum, softly at first, then with growing strength. The old hymn rose clear and pure in the darkness. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Outside, the hired men stirred at the sound of her voice carrying through the night air. One of them muttered something about giving me the creeps. But Karen kept singing. The melody strengthened her, reminded her that she wasn't alone. God was with her, even here. Miles away, Michael Boone knelt in the gathering dusk, studying broken branches and trampled snow. The trail was clear enough. Abel's party hadn't bothered to hide their passage. They'd pushed their horses hard, heading straight for the May Ranch. Michael's own mount stood quietly behind him, steam rising from its flanks. He'd pressed the animal as much as he dared, knowing he'd need its strength for whatever lay ahead. Now, as darkness fell, he knew he had to make camp or risk missing vital signs. Finding a sheltered spot beneath towering pines, Michael quickly made a minimal camp. No fire. He couldn't risk the smoke being spotted. He ate jerky and hard bread, letting his horse rest. Every muscle in his body ached to keep riding, to find. Karen now, but experience had taught him the value of patience in tracking. Wrapped in his coat, Michael knelt in the snow. Lord, he whispered, watch over her tonight. Give her strength. Help me find a way to bring her home. The stars wheeled overhead as he dozed fitfully, always alert for any sound. Near midnight, he thought he heard singing carried on the wind, faint and far away, but achingly familiar. His heart clenched, knowing Karen was calling out in the only way she could. Dawn found him already mounted and moving, reading the sign with practiced ease. The trail led him to a ridge overlooking Abel May's ranch. Michael lay flat in the snow, studying the layout through his rifle's scope. The ranch sprawled across a small valley, house, barn, corrals, and outbuildings. Two men stood guard near the barn, rifles ready. Another patrolled the house porch where Abel May paced restlessly. Michael counted at least 6 horses in the corral. Abel had brought in more men during the night. A frontal attack would be suicide. Even if Michael was the better shot, he couldn't take them all before they killed him, or worse, hurt Karen in retaliation. No, this would take cunning rather than force. Easing back from the ridge, Michael retreated into the shelter of the forest. His chest ached where he'd been slammed against the wagon during his desperate ride, but he ignored the pain. Physical discomfort meant nothing compared to what Karen must be enduring. He studied the terrain carefully, noting approaches, blind spots, patterns in the guards' movements. Abel May was no military man. His defenses had weaknesses. Michael just had to find the right one and wait for his moment. Settling into a hidden observation post, Michael began his vigil. He thought of Karen's smile, her quiet strength, the way she'd brought life back to his empty cabin. He remembered her standing tall despite her father's cruelty, remembered her gentle hands tending the sick, remembered her joy when he'd proposed. "Hold on, my love," he whispered. "I'm coming." Inside the barn, Karen dozed fitfully against the hay bale. Her arms ached fiercely from being bound, and thirst scratched at her throat. But as morning light crept through the barn's cracks, she found her resolve hadn't weakened. The bar scraped back and Abel May entered, still carrying her mother's quilt. His face was thunderous. "Well, ready to be reasonable?" Karen met his gaze calmly. "I've already given you my answer." "Stubborn fool." Abel shook the quilt violently. "You think this is some game? Those railroad men are coming today. They've got papers drawn up, just waiting for your signature. All you have to do is sign. And betray everyone who depends on that water?" Karen shook her head. "I won't do it." Abel's hands clenched on the quilt. For a moment, Karen feared he would tear it apart in his rage. But he mastered himself, face twisting into a cruel smile. "Maybe you need more persuasion," he said softly. "Those railroad men won't care if you sign those papers with broken fingers." One of the hired men stepped forward. "Mr. May, that ain't right. She's still your flesh and blood." "She's property," Abel roared. "I sold her once. I can do what I want with her now." He advanced on Karen, raising his hand. Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she began to sing, her voice rising pure and strong in the musty barn. "Be not afraid. I go before you always." Abel's hand faltered. Even the hired men stepped back, unsettled by the courage in her voice. The hymn filled the barn, reaching out through the cracks to float across the valley. "Stop that," Abel demanded, but Karen kept singing. Her voice grew stronger, carried by faith and defiance. "Come follow me, and I will give you rest." Far above, in his hidden position, Michael heard the song carrying clearly through the morning air. His hands tightened on his rifle stock as he recognized Karen's voice, strong and unbroken despite whatever she was enduring. His jaw clenched as he studied the ranch below through his scope. Soon, he promised silently. Soon, he would find a way to reach her. And Abel May would learn what happened to those who dared harm what Michael Boone loved. Karen shifted against the rough barn wall, her bound wrists aching. The morning light filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, casting thin strips of gold across the hay-strewn floor. Her father's threats echoed in her mind, but another voice spoke louder. Michael's steady words from that first day. "God don't make mistakes, least of all you." Drawing a deep breath, Karen lifted her voice in song. The hymn began softly, like a morning dove's call, but grew stronger with each verse. "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee." The melody floated through the cracks in the barn walls, drifting across the valley on the crisp mountain air. In the nearby fields, farmers paused their work, tools falling still in their hands. The pure, clear notes carried faith and defiance in equal measure. Morning by morning new mercies I see, all I have needed thy hand hath provided. Down in the valley, Mrs. Templeton stopped hanging laundry, her head tilting to listen. She remembered Karen's gentle hands tending her fevered son, the same voice that had sung through that long night now rising in strength. At the mercantile, customers and shopkeeper alike fell silent as the song reached them. Someone whispered, "That's the May girl, the one they call the mountain goddess." The hymns swelled, carried by the wind. "Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me." At the small church near the crossroads, Pastor Whitlow stepped out onto the porch, recognizing Karen's voice immediately. His weathered face hardened with resolve. This was no ordinary song, it was a cry for justice. "Brothers and sisters," he called to those gathering outside the church, "that's the voice of truth carrying across our valley. The same voice that's brought healing to our sick and comfort to our children." He gripped the porch railing, voice rising. "We cannot stand idle while Abel May trades his daughter's dignity for railroad gold." Meanwhile, in the woods above Abel's ranch, Michael Boone crept closer through the undergrowth. His years of mountain living had taught him to move silent as a shadow. He'd spent hours watching the guards' patterns, noting their blind spots. A twig snapped behind him. Michael spun, rifle ready, but relaxed when he recognized Tom Whitaker, one of the valley's most respected farmers. The older man raised his empty hands. "Heard the singing," Tom whispered. "Reckon you could use some help getting her out?" Michael studied him carefully before nodding. "Abel's got hired guns. Can't just shoot our way in. That'd put Karen in more danger." "Maybe we don't need guns at all." Tom gestured toward the valley. "Listen. That singing's drawing folks like moths to flame. Abel May's always ruled by fear, but he can't fight the whole valley." Together, they formulated a plan. Tom sent his youngest boy racing through the valley with messages while Michael kept watch on the ranch. As the afternoon waned, people began quietly gathering in the woods. Farmers, merchants, women with determined faces, even a few miners from the high camps. Inside the barn, Karen's voice had grown hoarse, but she kept singing. Her father had stormed in twice more, raging at her to stop, but the hymns were her weapon now, and she wielded them without fear. Darkness fell early, as it often did in the mountain valley. Abel May paced his porch, cursing under his breath. The railroad agents were due tomorrow, and he still didn't have his daughter's signature on those papers. A flicker of torchlight in the trees caught his eye. Then another. And another. "What in blazes?" he muttered, then shouted for his men. "Get out here! All of you." The hired guns emerged from the bunkhouse, rifles ready, but their confident swagger faltered as more torches appeared, spreading in a great arc around the ranch. Dozens of flames now, their glow revealing familiar faces, neighbors, townsfolk, people Abel had bullied and cheated for years. "This is private property," Abel roared, but his voice cracked. "I'll shoot any man who takes one step closer." From the darkness between the torches, Michael Boone stepped forward. His rifle was slung across his back, his empty hands raised. The firelight caught his scars, making his face look carved from stone. "You won't shoot anyone, Abel," Michael said quietly. "Your time of ruling by fear is done." "She's my daughter." Abel's face twisted with rage. "I sold her fair and square." "No man has the right to sell God's children." Pastor Whitlow's voice rang out as he stepped up beside Michael. "The Lord made Karen May to be a blessing to this valley, not a bargaining chip for your greed." More voices joined in, calling out from the torchlit crowd. "She saved my boy's life. Her singing brings comfort to the sick. She's worth more than your railroad money." Abel's hired guns exchanged uneasy glances. They'd signed on to intimidate a few farmers, not face down half the valley. One by one, they lowered their rifles. "You're all soft-headed fools," Abel spat. "That water rights deed is worth a fortune. The railroad don't own this," Valley Tom Whitaker cut in. "And neither do you, Abel May. God's waters flow for all his children, not just those with gold in their pockets. Michael took another step forward, his voice carrying clearly in the tense night air. Karen isn't yours to sell, Abel. She never was. She's a free woman, with a right to choose her own path. His eyes burned in the torchlight. And she chose to use her inheritance to protect this valley, not destroy it. The crowd murmured approval. More torches appeared as latecomers joined the gathering. Abel looked around wildly, seeing decades of bullying and cruelty reflected back in his neighbors' stern faces. "The deed is in that quilt," he snarled. "I'll burn it before I let you—" "No, you won't." Pastor Whitlow's quiet certainty cut through Abel's bluster. "You'll return both the quilt and Karen, unharmed. Then you'll face the consequences of your actions, before God and this community." The circle of torches tightened, neighbor after neighbor stepping forward. Not with weapons or threats, but with the stronger power of united conscience. Abel May had ruled by fear for so long he'd forgotten what real strength looked like, the strength of people standing together for what was right. From inside the barn, Karen's voice rose again, soft but unwavering. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." One by one, the gathered voices joined in, the old hymn swelling into a mighty chorus that echoed off the mountain walls. Even some of Abel's hired men found themselves humming along, caught up in the power of the moment. Abel May stood alone on his porch, his empire of fear crumbling before the stronger force of love and community. His hands, which had struck his daughter so often, now trembled as he gripped the porch railing. Michael Boone waited patiently in the torchlight, hands still raised in peace but eyes hard as steel. The time had come for justice to be done, not with bullets, but with the strength of neighbors standing together for what was right. The hymn rose to the stars, carrying hope and defiance on its wings. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The torchlight cast dancing shadows across the snow-covered yard of Abel May's ranch. Michael Boone stood steady in the golden glow, his scarred face illuminated by dozens of flames held high by determined townspeople. The moment hung suspended, like breath frozen in winter air. With deliberate slowness, Michael unslung his rifle. The crowd watched, transfixed, as he knelt and laid it gently in the snow. Rising, he stepped forward, hands spread wide in the flickering light. "Abel," he called, voice carrying clear and strong across the yard. "You sold her as flesh, but she is no property." His words rang with quiet conviction. "She is a daughter of heaven." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Women nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes. Men shifted their feet, remembering their own daughters at home. Mrs. Templeton clutched her shawl tighter, thinking of how Karen had tended her sick boy through the night. Abel May's face twisted with rage. His eyes darted wildly between the torches, counting his enemies. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. "Shoot them!" he screamed at his hired men. "What am I paying you for?" "Shoot them all." But his men stood frozen, rifles half raised. Karen's hymn still floated from the barn, pure and unwavering. The sound seemed to touch something deep in their hearts, something that money couldn't buy. One of the younger guns lowered his weapon entirely, taking a step backward. Pastor Whitlow moved forward to stand beside Michael. His white hair gleamed in the torchlight as he raised his Bible high. "There is a higher law than yours, Abel May," he declared. "God's law speaks of justice, mercy, and love. What father sells his child? What man trades his daughter's dignity for railroad gold?" The pastor's words struck home. Another of Abel's men dropped his rifle in the snow. Then another. The clatter of falling weapons echoed in the tense silence between verses of Karen's song. Abel's face went from red to purple. "Cowards!" he spat at his retreating men. "Weak-minded fools!" But his voice cracked with desperation as his carefully built world of control crumbled around him. Spittle flew from his lips as he whirled and stormed toward the barn. The crowd surged forward in alarm, but Michael raised his hand, holding them back. This moment needed to play out. Abel burst through the barn doors. Karen's voice faltered mid-verse as he grabbed her arm roughly, dragging her into the torchlight. Her dress was dirty from the barn floor, her wrists raw from the ropes, but her head was held high. "Look at her!" Abel shouted, shaking Karen like a rag doll. "My own flesh and blood betraying me, after all I've done." But Karen turned to face him, meeting his wild eyes with steady calm. The torchlight caught her face, showing not an ounce of fear. The crowd held its breath. "I forgive you," Karen said clearly, her voice carrying to every ear in the yard. "But I will not obey you." The simple words struck Abel like a physical blow. His grip on her arm loosened as he staggered back half a step. You. He stammered, but no more words came. "I forgive the shame you heaped on me," Karen continued, her voice growing stronger. "I forgive the cruel words and the selling of my person. I forgive it all." She straightened her shoulders. "But I am not yours to command. I belong to God alone, and He made me exactly as I should be." Abel's knees buckled. The rage drained from his face, leaving him looking old and lost. His hand fell away from Karen's arm as the weight of years of cruelty finally broke him. The gun slipped from his other hand, falling harmlessly into the snow. The crowd moved forward like a wave. Tom Whitaker and his sons quickly secured Abel's dropped weapon. Other hands gently supported Karen, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders. Mrs. Templeton hurried forward with a cup of water. Abel May sank to his knees in the trampled snow, all his power and bluster gone. The man who had ruled the valley through fear now looked small and broken, destroyed not by violence but by the stronger forces of love, courage, and community. Michael stepped forward and carefully untied Karen's wrists. His rough hands were gentle as he examined the rope burns. "You're the bravest person I have ever known," he whispered. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "God don't make mistakes," she quoted back to him. "The quilt," she said suddenly, looking around. "The deed." "Here," called a voice, and one of Abel's former hired men stepped forward, holding the carefully folded quilt. "Found it in the house." "Didn't seem right, him taking it from you." He handed it to Karen with an awkward bob of his head. Pastor Whitlow raised his hands for attention. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, "we've witnessed God's justice tonight. Not through force of arms, but through the power of love and the strength of community." He looked around the circle of faces. "Let us remember this. No one stands alone in this valley. We rise or fall together." The crowd murmured agreement. Someone started singing one of Karen's hymns, and others joined in. The sound swelled in the cold night air, a balm of healing after so much pain. Abel remained on his knees, shoulders shaking. Whether with sobs or rage, no one could tell. Two of the town's senior men stood guard over him, but there was no fight left in the broken rancher. His empire of fear had crumbled before the stronger power of forgiveness and united conscience. Karen stepped forward, still wrapped in the borrowed shawl, her mother's quilt clutched close. The deed that had caused so much strife was safe in its hidden pocket, but that seemed less important now. She looked at her father, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, not as the terrifying giant of her childhood, but as a small bitter man who had lost his way. "The water rights will be used fairly," she said quietly. "For all the valley's people, not just for profit." That's what Mother would have wanted. She paused, then added, "You're welcome to stay and work beside us, Father, if you can find it in your heart to change." Abel didn't respond. His face remained buried in his hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The mighty Abel May, who had ruled through fear for so long, had been undone not by bullets or fists but by his daughter's gentle strength and the power of community standing together. Michael moved to Karen's side, his quiet presence supporting her. The torchlight caught his face, and for the first time many in the crowd saw past his scars to the goodness beneath. This was the man who had started it all with an act of kindness, buying a girl to set her free. Pastor Whitlow stepped forward again. "Let's get Karen somewhere warm," he said practically. "Mrs. Templeton, could you—" "She'll stay with me tonight," Mrs. Templeton said firmly. "My girls will be glad of her company." She put a motherly arm around Karen's shoulders. The crowd began to disperse, some heading to their homes, others organizing to secure Abel and sort out the night's aftermath. The hired guns, now thoroughly shamed, helped gather their fallen weapons, accepting they would leave the valley without pay. As Karen turned to go with Mrs. Templeton, she looked back one last time at her father. In the dying torchlight, she saw tears running down his face, the first she'd ever seen him shed. Something tight and painful in her chest loosened slightly. Forgiveness, she realized, healed not only the forgiven, but also the one who offered it. "I'll come by first thing tomorrow," Michael told her softly. His hand touched hers briefly, warm and reassuring. Karen nodded, managing a tired smile. The night's courage had drained her, but she felt lighter than she had in years. As she walked away between Mrs. Templeton and her daughters, her voice lifted once more in song, soft but clear in the cold night air. Behind her, one by one, voices joined in, carrying the old hymn's promise of grace across the snowy valley. Even one of Abel's men found himself humming along as he gathered his gear, touched by something he couldn't quite name. The torches winked out one by one, leaving the stars to watch over the changed valley. Abel May's reign of fear was ended, transformed not by force but by the greater power of love, courage, and community united in faith. The barn doors burst open with a thunderous crack. Karen emerged into the crisp night air, her dress dusty and her cheek bruised, but her voice carried strong and clear across the yard. The hymn that had drawn the town to her aid still flowed from her lips, unwavering and pure. Michael rushed forward, gathering her into his arms. She melted into his embrace as cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. Tears streamed down both their faces as they held each other tight, relief and joy mingling in the cold night air. Pastor Whitlow stepped forward, raising the carefully folded quilt high above his head. The deed peeked from its hidden pocket, catching the torchlight. "Let all witness," he called out, his voice ringing with authority. "Karen May is the rightful steward of these water rights, granted by law and preserved by her mother's wisdom." The crowd burst into applause and shouts of approval. Two men led Abel away quietly, his head bowed, his swagger gone. Karen watched him go, then turned to Michael with wondering eyes. "You came without weapons," she whispered, touching his cheek. Michael smiled softly. "You showed me true strength lies in standing together, not in force." They mounted Michael's horse together, the precious quilt folded safely in Karen's lap. As they rode home through the starlit night, neighbors followed in wagons and on horseback, carrying pies, bread, and good cheer. The cabin glowed with warmth and welcome. Laughter rang from its walls, and music filled every corner. Where silence had reigned for so long, joy now made its home, transforming the lonely shack into something greater, a true home, blessed by community and love. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle awakening. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots beneath. In the weeks before the wedding, the entire community joined in preparation. Women gathered at the church, their needles flashing as they worked on Karen's dress, carefully incorporating her mother's cherished quilt into the design. On the morning of the ceremony, sunlight streamed through the chapel. The sun stood at the church door, her heart racing beneath the quilt-lined gown that the women had sewn with such care. As she walked down the aisle, heads turned and smiles bloomed. Michael waited at the altar, his weathered face transformed by joy. The old battle scars softened in the morning light. Pastor Whitlow's voice rang clear through the chapel as he spoke of God's redemptive love, of mercy freely given, and the promise of new beginnings. When Michael took Karen's hand and declared her his goddess of the high country, the congregation burst into spontaneous applause. The churchyard buzzed with celebration afterward. Tables groaned at a Wanabomber contributed by every family in the valley. Children twirled and laughed in the spring sunshine while elder folk raised their voices in beloved hymns. Karen looked around at the faces of her neighbors, now family, and felt truly at peace in her own skin for the first time. As evening fell, she and Michael mounted their horse together. They rode home through the gathering dusk, married at last, the warm glow of their cabin's lamp beckoning them forward through the darkness. Weeks passed like gentle mountain streams, each day flowing into the next with quiet purpose. Karen sat at her desk each morning, carefully reviewing water requests from valley families. With wisdom and fairness, she ensured every homestead received their share, marking allocations in neat columns with her steady hand. Michael's hammer rang through the crisp air as he added room after room to their cabin. What began as a lonely line shack transformed into a proper home, complete with a wraparound porch and extra bedrooms for visitors. Children from nearby farms often appeared at their door, drawn by the promise of Karen's sweet singing and fresh-baked treats. One peaceful evening, Karen settled into the porch rocker, her voice lifting softly in song while Michael mended the split-rail fence. The setting sun painted the valley in gold, and her melody seemed to dance on the evening breeze. Inside their bedroom, her mother's quilt lay carefully folded on their bed, a testament to inheritance, struggle, and triumph. As darkness crept across the land, Michael set down his tools and joined her on the porch. He covered her hand with his calloused one, his voice gentle but firm. "You were never useless," he said. "You were always a goddess." Karen's eyes filled with grateful tears as she gazed across their flourishing valley. Warm lamplight spilled from their windows into the gathering night, and laughter echoed within the walls of their home, no longer lonely, but filled with faith, love, and the promise of tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.